Hello. In this lecture, we'll continue to take a look at some views of distributive justice and some views about different ways of thinking about what kind of a society is the best one, or how a society should decide to allocate its resources. And so the topic for today is prioritarianism, okay, otherwise known as the priority view. And to discuss the priority view, we have an excerpt from an article by Otsuka and Voorhoeve. Prioritarianism, I should say a note about this particular view. The view was actually originally proposed by Derek Parfit, who you're familiar with from the previous unit, in the 1991 Lindley Lecture. The Lindley Lecture is a yearly lecture, so they do one of these a year at the University of Kansas, and it's generally in terms of value theory, ethics, etc. It's a very productive lecture series. Almost all the Lindley lectures have been really quite excellent, and Parfit's is no exception. But rather than actually using the Derek Parfit piece, I've gone ahead and gone for this Otsuka and Voorhoeve piece because even though they actually disagree with the view ultimately, like the ultimate purpose of their article is to disagree with the priority view and agree instead with the egalitarian view, right? The view that equality is by itself valuable, right? But the idea is that in this particular piece, they explain the prioritarian view so well and refer to some objections to the prioritarian view that weren't available when Parfit proposed the view. Of course, no objections were available when Parfit proposed the view. He had only just proposed it. And so, again, because they explain it so well, that I'm going to use their article instead of the going all the way to the original. And so also, you see the parenthetical here, let this be a lesson. In general, it's always a good idea to try and, especially if you disagree with a view, what you want to do is you want to make sure that when you describe it in a way that anybody who actually did agree with the view would say, yes, that's exactly my view, right? There's no real progress to be made if you describe, say, some dumb version of a view that nobody really holds. That doesn't make any progress. What you want to do is, if you're going to respond to a view, you have to describe the best possible version of that view that exists. And if in so doing, if in describing the best possible version of some view, you come to think, well, gosh, maybe this view isn't so bad after all, well, then you've made progress. You've replaced a worse idea with a better idea. Right. So again, in general, it's very, very important. It's tempting to take some view that isn't your view and to represent it as being stupid. But very, very few people actually hold legitimately stupid views. Views that are legitimately stupid tend to be discarded by basically everybody. So in any case, I just wanted to say that about this particular article, that though this article doesn't really agree with the prioritarian view ultimately, they do explain the view very well, and we do want to take a look at the view is certainly important enough to be disagreed with, right? It's an important view that you're going to want to be aware of. And so our authors here, this is Michael Otsuka and Alex Voorhoeve. They are both currently at the London School of Economics, which is a pretty high-powered philosophy department, in these days. So look, there they are, right? Color photographs. I mean, they're still live, they're still working. They're in the middle of very productive careers. So the first example that they want to give us is what they call this the two-child case. Okay. And it goes this way. It says, imagine that you are the parent of two young teenagers, Anne and Ben, right? Ben has recently been diagnosed with a condition that will soon give rise to a serious physical disability, but Anne has been given a clean bill of health. You have recently lost your job, but have offers in two other places. You must choose whether to take a city job and move your family to cramped urban accommodation in an unpleasant neighborhood with mediocre schools, or take a job on the outskirts of town and move your family to the open spaces of a suburb with excellent schools. Either option would be equally good insofar as your own well-being is concerned, but they would not be equally good insofar as the well-being of each of your children is concerned. If you move to the city, able-bodied Anne, who loves nature and sports, will be hemmed in and have only a mediocre education. But soon-to-be disabled Ben will have access to special medical facilities that will somewhat but far from wholly alleviate the effects of his disability. If you move to the suburb, Anne will flourish, but Ben will not receive this treatment. Moreover, if you move to the suburb, the boost in well-being to Anne will be greater than the boost in well-being to Ben if you move to the city. Right? And so then they say table 1 here, as we see, represents the relevant levels of lifetime well-being for your two children. All right, so take a look at this table, right? The idea is that if one were to choose the suburb, okay, the overall utility, right? This recall from the rational choice theory lecture. Essentially, what we're doing here is we're putting numbers on just people's actual preferences. Assume that 30 indicates Ben's actual preferences compared to a 39, that 70 represents Anne's really total well-being, all of her preferences, all things being equal, versus this sort of a 60. And so you see that Anne does better in the suburb, okay? Ben does better in the city, but the difference between the two is that Ben does 9 better in the city and Anne does 10 better in the suburb. And so there's a real question of what to do here. So if you were to maximize your expected utility, right? Remember, that is just choosing the option that has the highest average, right? Then the suburb would be the appropriate choice because if you, again, add these two things up, you get, of course, a total of 100, which divided by 2 is 50, right? So there you go. There's your average. If you move to the city, okay, you get, this here, which is going to add up to sort of, 99, which divided by 2 is, I guess, 49 and a half, right? And so yes, the city has a slightly smaller average than the suburb. And so again, if all you're trying to do is just get the higher average out of whichever one is the case, then it's pretty clear that you choose the suburb, okay? But looking at this kind of a situation, right, putting yourself in the shoes of this actual parent, I don't know that the decision is all that clear, or if maximizing one's expected utility really seems like the best idea. And Otsuka and Voorhoeve agree. They point out that the more egalitarian decision, right, if you were trying to make a different decision on a different basis than simply maximizing the utility, that is choosing just whatever has the higher average, the egalitarian decision would be to move to the city. And the egalitarian would point out that the inequality, okay, between the two children, Anne and Ben, is sort of bad in itself, and it's worse than the benefit that is gained from the higher average that the suburb represents. So even though the suburb represents an average that is half a point higher than the city, the suburb also has a much larger inequality in it than the city has. And so given that, okay, it makes sense to choose the city, right? The city is the more egalitarian option, the option that values equality more highly. Now, of course, if we're going to be talking about theories of well-being that value equality highly, we should also bring Rawls in here. Because again, remember, Rawls has a perspective that does value equality highly, but there's a reason why it values equality highly. It's not just because it does or something like that. Again, it's always important to remember why Rawls has a theory that it values equality highly and why he thinks so. Equally, it's important to remember why Nozick has a theory that does not value equality particularly highly, and in fact doesn't really value it at all. And so, again, Rawls would point out that the best decision here would be to look at this situation and choose whether to move to the city or to the suburb, without knowing who you were going to be in the city or the suburb, right? So if you didn't know whether you were Anne or were Ben, which one would you pick? And again, when you look at it this way, you think, well goodness, how about we choose the city? Because Anne's still doing okay, but Ben is doing much better, right? And so the idea is that just in case I'm Ben, I want to make things as good as I can for myself, right? Because Anne is going to be doing better in either case. And so again, this is why Rawls's theory tends to often agree with the egalitarian and often tends to value equality highly, because using that maximin rule, that is choosing the greatest minimum from behind the veil of ignorance, you very often end up choosing a situation that has more equality in it. That tends to be the way to get that highest minimum. Right. So far so good. This example seems to indicate that there's some good reason for being an egalitarian. That is some good reason for valuing equality over simply maximizing utility. However, sometimes there's a thing called the leveling down objection that they explain very, very briefly. I wanted to flesh that out a little bit. And this is an objection to egalitarianism generally, or to the egalitarian view. And here's how the leveling down objection goes. So imagine that at some future time, for example, Anne is afflicted by the same condition that has befallen Ben. And so if you take a look at the second table here, right, this one here, this one reflects the new situation. Okay, so the idea is that if the same thing happens to Anne that happened to Ben, then she'll be roughly the same off in the city as Ben is, and the same off in the suburb as Ben is. Now, of course, in this case, the city is the dominant choice, right? Both do better in the city than in the suburb, and so it makes sense to choose the city. But that's not really the point. Okay, the point is when we compare this second table with the first table, right? It seems like the egalitarian would have to say, because moving to the city will give each child the same outcome, and moving to the suburb would give each child the same outcome, that in some sense this second situation is better than this first situation. Even though when we take a look at the totals, right, the total amount of utility in the second table, it's much lower than the total amount of utility in the first table, right? And so again, if you think that equality is really, really important, perhaps you're going to have to say that that second situation where Anne has been leveled down to Ben's level, right? That's why we call it the leveling down objection, that's better somehow. Okay, and that seems a little bit wrong-headed. The point of the leveling down objection is to say, look, it seems crazy to say that the second situation is better than the first one. Of course, the first situation is better. So simply bringing Anne down to Ben's level doesn't improve anything, except for the amount of inequality in the situation, and that seems to be of secondary importance. Right, so that's how the leveling down objection goes. Otsuka and Voorhoeve mention that they themselves don't think that this is a very good objection to egalitarianism, and that others have not regarded it as very powerful. They cite, for example, Larry Temkin, who wrote a really excellent book about inequality called Inequality, right? So that's effectively what's going on here, right? But it's a very common objection. Okay, so one more time, the leveling down objection points out that the egalitarian should have to say that the second situation is better than the first because it is more equal, and something seems very wrong with saying that, right? Because the only thing that has happened is that things have gotten worse for Anne, right? And so how is that better, right? Yes, it's more equal, but is it better, right? And that's the objection. Now, of course, one of the reasons why Otsuka and Voorhoeve don't really take this objection very seriously, and why others have not taken this objection very seriously, is that the egalitarian here has a pretty good response. Okay, and one good response that the egalitarian can make to this objection is that they need not say that equality is the only thing that matters. Okay, so I think most egalitarians will look at the situation here and say, okay, look, the situation here, that in this first situation. When we move to the second situation, it has gotten better in one respect only. It has gotten more equal, and other things being equal, that would be good, except that the only reason things are more equal is because Anne has simply lost a lot of well-being going from the first situation to the second. So the egalitarian here doesn't have to say that equality is the only thing that matters. They only have to say that it matters a lot, right? And so the idea is, again, as far as equality goes, the second situation is better than the first. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that matters, and that you have to say that, in all possible respects, the second situation is better than the first, or the fact that the second situation is more equal than the first will outweigh all possible other concerns. Certainly the egalitarian doesn't have to say that, and many, in fact, don't. Right, but it's worth knowing about how the leveling down objection works and how it interacts with this particular example. So given that the leveling down objection may still, some do credit it as a pretty good objection against the egalitarian view. It seems like if you want to say that you should move to the city, right, to benefit Ben, right, more than, and choose that lower, that slightly lower average in order to get a more equal situation, perhaps there's a reason besides equality itself that one might choose that option. Okay, and that's where prioritarianism is going to come in. So this is a quote from the article. Otsuka and Voorhoeve write, in sum, one can characterize prioritarianism as the conjunction of the following three claims, right? First, the claim of diminishing marginal value, that is that each person's utility has diminishing marginal value. In a second, we're going to get to what diminishing marginal value is. Separability, right? The moral value of an increment in a person's utility does not depend on how anyone else fares. We'll talk about that in a second. And maximization, that we ought to maximize the sum total of the moral value of the utility of persons, which is their priority-weighted utility, right? That's actually fairly clear once you get the first two things. So let's take a look at those first two things in turn. All right, so first let's talk about diminishing marginal value. And diminishing marginal value is a really, really important concept, not just for this article, but it's just a plain old important concept, right? It's an important concept for a lot of different areas of life. Okay, so diminishing marginal value means this. It's this notion that each unit of a thing becomes less valuable the more of that thing that one has. Right, and we can come up with lots of examples, but I'd like to start with this one. Right, so imagine that somebody owes you $5 or something like that, right? They might say, hey, instead of giving you $5 in cash, how about I buy you a cheeseburger today at lunch, right? And again, assuming the cheeseburger costs somewhere around $5, then that seems like it might be a pretty fair deal. Okay, so the idea is that you get a cheeseburger. Say, for example, this here cheeseburger from Burger King, right? Or something. Notice, you're never going to get a cheeseburger that looks like that. So how about, okay, there we go. There's that. There's cheeseburger from Burger King, right? In fact, it's exactly the same burger. You just, pick a more realistic as opposed to a more sort of marketing image. All right, so there you go. So say, it pays you, but now say somebody owed you $10 and offered to buy you two $5 cheeseburgers, right? Is this a good trade, right? I mean, maybe if you're going to eat two cheeseburgers, it's okay, but probably not so much, right? So the idea is that after that first cheeseburger, you're a lot less hungry, right? So that two cheeseburgers is not actually twice as valuable as one cheeseburger. Okay, that's diminishing marginal value. And we see it very quickly with cheeseburgers. Now, of course, imagine somebody offers, say, okay, look, instead of paying you $15, how about I give you 3 cheeseburgers, right? Look, 3 cheeseburgers is worth maybe a little bit more than 1 cheeseburger, right? That's it. 10 cheeseburgers is, so again, imagine you're hungry enough to eat 2 cheeseburgers. 10 cheeseburgers is worth 2 cheeseburgers, right? That's, diminishing marginal value is very steep on cheeseburgers, right? Each extra cheeseburger doesn't add really any extra value. Somebody says, look, I'll give you 10 cheeseburgers for this thing here. And you're like, no, I don't think so. How about 11, right? That's just gonna make no difference. Okay, that extra, so the more cheeseburgers you have, the less any additional cheeseburger matters to you. And it becomes pretty steep after that. And again, lots of things are amenable to diminishing marginal value, including things like money, okay? The more money you have, the less every dollar really means to you. And that's, that's just the way things are, right? And hours of sleep, again, it might help you to have an extra hour of sleep, but it's not gonna help you twice as much to have an extra 2 hours, and it's not gonna help you 3 times as much to have an extra 3 hours. And at some point it even becomes kind of destructive, right? You end up sort of losing a whole day or something like that. So again, everything is subject to diminishing marginal value, some things more than others. And again, it's a tremendously important concept. And so, in fact, one of the places that the concept of diminishing marginal value has the most interesting application is in taxation, right? So again, imagine that you regard you see the necessity for taxation, right? You see the necessity for everybody to be more or less, compelled by the rules to kick in some money to support the society as a whole. Because we got to have our roads, we got to have our power grid, we got to have we got to have law and order, we got to have a financial system, police, the courts, the military, all that stuff. We got to have we got to have a functioning society here, and that doesn't happen for free. You have to pay people to run it, and so yeah, taxes. Okay, so the idea is that because everybody more or less equally benefits from society, the idea is that everyone should more or less equally support that society. And so initially, maybe it seems like the taxes should be the same dollar amount for everybody, right? But you can, I think, quickly see the trouble with that. Okay, so say, for example, everybody, say everyone had to pay, say, $10,000 in taxes, right? Well, imagine somebody who only makes $10,000 a year is going to be, completely, this is going to be an impossible burden for them. Whereas somebody who makes $100,000 a year, this is not that big of a deal, right, in comparison. So even though it's the same dollar amount, it's going to have some wildly disproportionate effects. So that seems a little unfair. And so you might say then, okay, how about something like a flat tax? And usually when people say flat tax, they mean sort of a flat percentage or something like that. But again, consider, say, maybe it's 10%. Consider again this person who has $10,000, and if you take 1,000 of their dollars, right, that's 10%. That's going to be a much bigger hit for that person than that $10,000 is for someone who has $100,000. And so again, the effects are really quite unequal, and it seems that some are sacrificing much more to pay their taxes than others. And so what you really want is you want people not to pay the same dollar amount or not necessarily the same percentage. What you do is you want people to pay the same value. Okay, and this is where diminishing marginal value comes in. The more money you have, the less each individual dollar actually counts. And so this is what sense you have when you say, okay, then you want to have a fairly low percentage at low income levels and a fairly high percentage at high income levels, because even a high percentage of a high income is still a pretty large number. And so again, there's if you have again $10 billion, okay, and you get to keep $2 billion of it, you still got $2 billion, right? So that's the idea, is that diminishing marginal value plays a large role in what's called a graduated income tax, right? Which is basically every nation in the world has some version of a graduated tax, and it's because of diminishing marginal value. Again, it's a really important concept, not just for our view today, but for lots of views. So given that, how does it then apply to our view today? So the idea is this. Again, to recap this idea about diminishing marginal value, if you give a millionaire $1,000, it will have little or no effect on their quality of life, right? I mean, because it just, it adds a little more of something that they already have a lot of. It just, it makes no real difference. I saw, like, in fact, a multi-billionaire was giving some speech, about sort of the power of it was about what's called a trickle-down theory of economics, which is a thing from mostly the 80s. And the idea is that the more very, very rich people you have, the more that money sort of trickles down to elsewhere in the economy. And this particular multi-billionaire thought it was a silly idea, and he says, okay, look at the pants I'm wearing here. My business partner calls these my manager pants. They're particularly nice pants. They cost about $200. But what am I going to do? Buy 1,000 pair of these pants, right? If more people, right, if more people had just a little bit more money who aren't billionaires, they're going to put more of that money into the economy, right? Then certainly I will, right? So again, he seems to have a point here, and he's again making a point about diminishing marginal value. So the idea is that then if you give that same $1,000, right, to somebody who is broke, right, it will have a huge effect, right? Because again, because of diminishing marginal value, things are more valuable if you don't have very many of them, and they're less valuable if you already have a lot of them. Okay, so giving a benefit to someone who has less is always going to be more impactful than giving a benefit to those who have more. That's the idea behind the priority view. Okay, benefits to those less well off have more value per unit than benefits to those who are better off. And so if you think about that example between Anne and Ben, right, that first table where there's a higher average to move to the suburb, but more sort of equality if you move to the city. The priority view is going to say, look, that 9 points that you can benefit Ben, because Ben is simply doing less well than Anne, is going to be more valuable to Ben than the 10 points are going to be to Anne, because she already starts out at a higher level. And so the idea is, choosing this higher average would be like giving, $10,000 to a millionaire as opposed to giving $1,000 to somebody who's broke. Yeah, maybe it's more total money given away, right? But you'd be doing a much greater benefit giving the smaller amount of money to somebody who really needs it than even a much larger amount of money to somebody who doesn't, right? And that's the basic idea behind the priority view, and it's a pretty compelling idea. Now let's take a look at separability. Okay, this is that second feature of the priority view that leads up to sort of maximization, right? The idea that you want to choose whatever has the highest sort of priority weighted average. Okay, separability is this notion that you don't actually have to compare people with each other in order to see that you ought to be benefiting those who have less, right? This is actually this is a quote that Otsuka and Voorhoeve quote from the Parfit piece. Now they cite it as a 1995 article, and it's possible that there's a publication out there that has a 1995 publication date of Parfit's talk. The talk itself was in 1991, and that's the version of it that I have and have referred to in the past. But in any case, this is a quote from that talk. Parfit says, people at higher altitudes find it harder to breathe. Is this because they are higher up than some people? Well, in one sense, yes. But they would find it just as hard to breathe even if there were no other people who were lower down. In the same way, on the priority view, benefits to the worse off matter more, but that is only because these people are at a lower absolute level. It is irrelevant that these people are worse off than others. Benefits to them would matter just as much, even if there were no others who were better off. Okay, so again, using our example from the previous slide, imagine, giving $1,000 to somebody who's broke, right? This will help them a lot, even if nobody is richer than they are. Okay, whether somebody is or isn't richer than they are, that benefit will help them more than it will help somebody who starts off in a better position. Okay, again. And so what's going on with the priority view is that we're not, in fact, comparing anybody to anybody else, right? Which is something you have to do if you want to talk about equality or inequality. Instead, Parfit Parfit points out, and Otsuka and Voorhoeve also describe this priority view that just says, okay, look, we're not going to compare people with each other. Instead, we're going to adopt a view in which it's important, again, mostly because of diminishing marginal value, to benefit those who are in worse positions, right? Again, not because it makes it more equal, but because those benefits end up doing more good when given where they are most impactful. And so Parfit points out these things then about the prioritarian view, how it works, and what's good about it. So he explains, it certainly, this priority view explains the intuition behind choosing the city over the suburb, right? And that rationale is that a benefit of 9 to Ben, who is worse off, is better than a benefit of 10 to Anne, who starts in a better off position, right? Again, largely because of this diminishing marginal value. And you can see the separability there. It's not that we have to compare Ben with Anne necessarily in order to say that a benefit to Ben would be more valuable than even a somewhat larger benefit to Anne, because, again, Ben starts off in a worse place. And of course, the priority view is not vulnerable to the leveling down objection, right? If you sort of level Anne all the way down to Ben, the prioritarian doesn't say that that's any better for any reason at all. While the egalitarian, I guess, at least has to say that it's better in the sense that it's more equal, right? And so there's certainly that goes in there. And so the thing to remember then is that it's the overall point, okay? The overall point is that on this prioritarian view, equality is not actually what's important, even though it can sort of look like it when you're looking at these kinds of examples. But rather what's important is that the least well-off have priority when benefits are to be conferred. So if you're a prioritarian, you would look at a society and say, look, whenever a society has some benefit to be conferred, something that has to be, what it ought to do is prioritize benefiting those who are the least well off. Not because it will make things more equal, even though it very well may, but because the benefits to those who have less are much greater and more impactful than benefits to those who have more. And that it can make sense to choose an option that has an at least somewhat lower total or average in favor of having a higher diminishing marginal value weighted total or average, right? Again, keeping in mind this idea of diminishing marginal value. Right, so that's the priority view, that's prioritarianism, and it's the third of three views that we've taken a look at in terms of that advocate one particular way of looking at social welfare or some society's distribution of its resources. Again, recall we've seen Rawls's view, which tends to value equality very highly, but again, remember why he says that equality is valuable. We've seen a theory of justice from Nozick that indicates that equality is not valuable at all. But again, remember why he doesn't think that equality is valuable and why he thinks a society should be the way it is. And then, of course, recall that a prioritarian view is the view that says that equality is not by itself important, but rather what's important is that the least well-off have priority. Okay. Again, remember that they said, but remember why they say so, especially given the concept of diminishing marginal value. That's really the key, I think, to understanding the priority view.